Hi, everyone. My name is Kerilyn Schewel, and I'm very happy to be here to moderate this panel. Maybe we can just start by giving another round of applause for those amazing presentations. They were really, truly excellent. And I want to make a few comments before asking each of the fellows a question and then turning it to the audience. And one thing I want to highlight first is just how enriching it is to learn from your personal experiences and how the insights and the suggestions that you're offering today are coming from a place of real knowledge because of the experiences that you've had before doing your graduate level studies. And so, you know, Christian, that we can see the pictures of you being present in these reintegration discussions and visiting these rural communities and seeing what is the reality, what's happening, really how valuable that is. And Mustafa, I think we were all moved hearing the story, not only of your childhood, but your work with this project between 2018 and 2021, and particularly this story of walking from village to village, 1 mile from the Taliban, not bringing a weapon in order to build trust, is, you know, that's a real commitment to development. And then Jorge, what a pleasure to have someone who's been a captain in the Chilean army who's helping us think about how do we use the military. I mean, I study migration, and I think it's very easy to come across perspectives within academia where we are very quickly critical of the military and the militarization of the border. And I think something that Jorge has brought to his perspective is a real sensitivity to the people who have the boots on the ground, who are in the army. So he's thinking very much about the rights of migrants, but he's also thinking about what's fair to these soldiers who have to police the border, you know, and I've heard many stories of, you know, soldiers not being prepared or trained to be able to play this role of deterring people from crossing the border. And so a sensitivity to that as well has brought a real humanization, I think, of the conversation about what do we do where we see these crises at the border. So the title for this panel is In Search of Sustainable Development and Peace. And I think each of you brought out the interconnection between sustainable development and peace. And actually that sustainable development is a prerequisite for peace. I think, Christian, what you really showed is that, you know, in Colombia, as we all well remember, this peace process, I mean, there was so much hope, so much enthusiasm. Finally, a peace agreement has been made. But without that investment in the sustainable development and the promises that came with that peace agreement, that it was doomed to fail. And I think really showing what that looks like in rural places, and the need for local development in those rural places, I think you bring an interesting dimension to that conversation. So you're also, you know, thinking about, we can't just expect the government to be able to do everything either. So then how might there be creative ways to have public-private partnerships to be able to meet the needs of more rural, peripheral places? Mustafa, I really like that you titled your talk Humanitarian Aids to Sustainable Communities, and the emphasis on communities. And I think one thing that really came out when you think about a shift from an aid-based approach towards a sustainable development community-led approach is this theme of capacity building. And it seems like that's something that's been interwoven into everything that you were doing, that this was very much about raising up community leaders, teaching skills that people would be able to carry with them. And again, local development that integrates humanitarian aid with more development-based approaches. And I think this really challenges us to think about how do we move beyond sort of the silos that exist within the development field, and even within how finances flow. And then, of course, I think many of the insights that you raised in your presentations also come out in your presentation, Jorge, in the sense that, of course, it's also the lack of sustainable development. It's also political and economic crises that are the root causes of migration that is then crossing the Chilean border and causing, the perception of border crisis elsewhere. And I think one thing that you highlighted that's really quite kind of provocative is that this need not be a crisis, and that if we want to rethink how to use the Army at the border, there's actually a deeper question about how we see migration and whether the influx of migrants is inevitably something that leads to crisis within societies. And I think what Operation Welcome can teach us is that actually with a more coordinated federal response that distributes migrants to places where actually people need migrant workers, that actually that can be more beneficial to the migrants themselves, but also to destination societies, and that immigrants can also contribute to sustainable development at destination. But to do that means really rethinking kind of how we see this migration and how we facilitate it, how we manage it. And that's a real challenge, not just to Chile, but of course, something that we're all thinking about in the US today, I'm sure. And then the last point that just kind of struck me listening to you present is just how much the periphery of countries matter to the peace of countries as a whole. And so hearing about whether it's the border of Chile or rural Colombia or these northern villages in Afghanistan, often when we see and we measure development, we tend to use national level indicators, in terms of progress in education or income or GDP, whatever it might be, but how much those national level indicators might mask, and in particular, masking rural and urban differences. And so I think, what's happening at the periphery of countries, what's happening in rural places is fundamental to the future sustainable development of countries and to the future promise of peace in these places. So thank you so much for your presentations, all the insights that came out of them. They were very thought-provoking for me. And so I'd like to ask you each a different question. And I'll go in the order of the presentation. So Mustafa, my question for you, and I'm sure others in the room were wondering as well, I mean, you described this amazing project from 2018 to 2021, looking at education, agriculture, and livestock, employment questions. You were thinking about women, good governance. And then, of course, the end of your project was 2021, when there was also the Taliban takeover. And so my first question is, what happened, when the Taliban did take over? What happened to the results of these projects? And then my second question to you is, what insights do you have for strategies for sustainable development that might be more enduring, even in the context of a Taliban takeover or a Taliban administration? Are there still strategies for development that will continue to improve lives and well-being, even in the midst of very difficult political and other crises? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kerilyn. I think it's difficult questions, particularly in context of Afghanistan. First, I would like to just say a few short words about how we developed this project. So this program that had three components: agriculture, education, and good governance. So I was involved with implementation of different projects. So these projects we come up with going to the community, listening to them, and developing a community-led solutions. That what are the community needs? Because this is very important. And next thing is the context. Because something doesn't work in the village of Afghanistan that we read or we study in the university. So we have to develop anything that based on the understanding, based on the needs of the people. So after the, particularly this project was from 2018 to 2021. And after 2021, in the beginning of 2022, third-party evaluation carried out to assess the effectiveness of this project. And the evaluation findings that I'm analyzing that as well and incorporating in my master project. It shows that the project is continuous because in education, we build skills that we transferred and delivered those skills to the women, particularly with the vocational training centers that we provided short-term skills like bakery, tailoring, that women can go to their home and they can do their work from their home. And why these youth development centers? So we built it for youth development centers that each could teach more than 400 students from boys and mainly the girls. But unfortunately, in this context, so working with the woman in the future is a challenging, but we have alternative solutions. And since it was a capacity building, we transfer the capacities, so it is with them forever. And regarding the strategy, since I was involved with many different projects, and as a monitoring and evaluation manager, since I assist different projects, and I come up, and also I'm working with in my master projects, so combining humanitarian and development is one solution. Because in a community in Afghanistan, their conflict affected, they have multiple needs. If we go, I saw the project that donors approach them and provide them hygiene kits, but their main demand was food. So in the meantime, we have to consider those multiple needs and combine the humanitarian development. I'm not talking about the emergency like natural disasters that we had different projects like emergency response mechanism, but part of that, we have humanitarian projects that is semi-development, and we incorporate with the development factors. So this, how can it help? It helps that it increase the coordination among the donors, and also it prevent from program overlaps. And this also help the beneficiaries to come up with the adversities. You know, if we deliver the aid, only deliver the aid, so 49 kg of wheat, for example, there were many projects like this. So it was only for a week or 2 weeks. And after that, the beneficiaries, the people who are vulnerable, left like that. So developing a concept to address multiple needs and to help them to come with a self-reliance is the strategy that, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christian, I think one thing that you emphasized in your suggestion for alternatives is really to strengthen the underlying development in these regions to really set the foundation for a peace process to be successful. And in the back of my mind, also in light of Jorge's presentation and my interest in migration, you know, there's another dynamic that's at play in Colombia right now, after 2016 in particular as well. And that's the crisis in the neighboring country of Venezuela. And of the estimates are that there are maybe 8 million people who have left Venezuela, and Colombia has been one of the largest host countries for Venezuelan migrants. And so I was just curious to hear a little bit more about, has this migration dynamic impacted the peace process in Colombia? If so, how? And if not, why not? And what can we maybe learn from that?
Well, is it working? Yeah. That's a great question, Professor Kerilyn. And by the way, I'm glad that I'm in the same panel with you moderating. Kerilyn's a brilliant professor. I'm her fan. Definitely. So I come actually from working, before going to Colombia, I was working in Operation Welcome as presented by Jorge on the Brazilian border. And being in Colombia, well, you saw how complex this context of peace agreement is, right? And to be implemented especially. And as you mentioned, Kerilyn, Colombia is the country, so 8 million Venezuelans are displaced from Venezuela, are migrants outside of Venezuela right now, but Colombia received 2.5 million Venezuelans. So if you remember, the population of Colombia is 44 million. That represents 5% of the population. So a country that already struggles to implement the peace process, to implement development, to reach its arms, to extend its arms to remote areas and the rural population, to be in the territory, to be present with this institutions for its population. How can this pressure of 2.5 million people more, how can the government deal with this, right? So it's very complex. And I was there while I was working there. I lived right next and worked right next to the Pan American Road, the highway, right? It's a highway that crosses the entire America. And the Venezuelans, we could see them coming down from Venezuela with their backpacks, with their babies, with their little carts, bringing their stuff down on the highway to stop in Colombia, to go to Peru, to go to Ecuador, to go to Chile. So it was a very complicated situation. And indeed, many of the Venezuelans that were coming and leaving Venezuela, they were stopping in Colombia and in the south of Colombia, in the rural areas, and they didn't have anything. They didn't have money, they didn't have jobs. Some of them, unfortunately, ended up working for the guerrillas in illicit activities because they represented cheap labor. They represented someone that would accept anything to have something to eat. And it was very to see Venezuelans and working with the guerrillas, for the guerrillas, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't have a choice. So unfortunately, that's the reality there. And hello, I swear it's not my fault. So it's pretty common to see, meaning there is an impact in this peace process, and it doesn't make it any easier. Actually, it brings more challenges for the government to address this other population, vulnerable population, that it's also in need. So.
And then, as you mentioned, many of these migrants are moving down to Chile. And they're not just moving to Chile, many are coming to the US as well from Venezuela. And you know, the example that you gave of Operation Welcome in Brazil and the insights that you think we can learn from it, of course, I was thinking how nice it would be in the US if we did have a federally coordinated response. And I think what we see playing out is this real tension in the US between the state level responses, the federal level responses, calls to militarize the border even more intensively. And so I just wanted to ask you about, you know, what do you see parallels in what's happening with the border crisis in Chile and what we see in the US? And do you think there are insights that the US can also learn from Operation Welcome?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that, well, the only thing we have in common is the actual fact that one person wants to move from a country to the US or to Chile. That's the only thing we can compare. The other thing that we can see is that when a person decides to move, they will move no matter what. So by increasing restrictions by laws or by increasing restrictions by physical security in the border, this will increase the irregular migration because these people want to move no matter what from their country to their new destination. It's a normal process. And you can see in the Chilean case, what happened is that in 2018, we had the announcement of this new migratory law, which addressed inclusivity, but it also has the responsibility to consulates in the other countries to give visas for people to migrate. So in the case, for example, of Haiti and Venezuela, people who were desperate to move to Chile, they said, I can't wait until the consulate gives me an appointment, 6 months, a year. They just took their things to move ahead. So we started with an increase of irregular migration, and then they announced, let's use the military. So what happened next is that we increased the alternatives for that irregular migration. So traveling by foot over 4,500 meters above sea level under harsh conditions during the night, minus 20 degrees during the day, above 40, highlands of the Chilean northern part, and that desert. It's a complicated issue to address. So people were trying to do that. They were then relying on smugglers not to risk their lives, but they actually made it worse. So, and we also are using forces. We're using the armed forces, which can be seen as a security component, but we're actually, and I'm saying this for 18 years in the Army, we are not prepared, we are not educated for migration management. We were prepared and educated for defense, for war. That's the mission. So when you take these people out and you put it in a different context, it's difficult to address these issues in a normal way, as it could be, for example, a border police, or even the police force or customs in their own countries. Differences: a federal government, a centralized government. That's the main difference we have between the two countries. Chile's law, like I mentioned before, talks about inclusion. So we have a contradiction between what we have in the law and what we're currently doing at the border. So my proposal is to address migration management in that inclusive way, using the capacity and capabilities of the armed forces. We're very good at one thing in peacetime, and that's logistics, administrative support. We're excellent at that. Let's use our capabilities doing that. And the other thing that it's interesting is that Chile has a complicated legal system. So even though we have a presidential decree that allows the armed forces to be employed at the border, and we have rules of the use of force under that presidential decree, this was a thing that the Congress passed to the president as a constitutional reform. So for a period of 90 days, the president could issue a special decree to allow these things. So what happens is that we have a decree that has the same legal stature as the normal law, but at the same time, we have a Congress that is discussing these things. So this brings a legal uncertainty for people on the ground. It's like when you do, for example, a tax reform, and you want to bring investors down, and no, we're discussing here, but the president is doing this. So do they want to invest in the country? Do they want to move ahead? It's the same thing with the Army. People on the ground are, I wouldn't say fear, but they are very uncertain of what could happen if they actually employ the force. And normally, the employment of force in the military is lethal force. So that brings a problem. Regarding what you said about Brazil, I think what we can take as an excellent example, but this is a little bit more above my scope of research, is the actual relocation process they do. I could see that the US could implement something similar and take the stress out of, for example, the state of Mexico, the state of Texas, and relieve the pressure they have currently and address it to other states to equalize, like the capacity of the United States immigration management. In Chile, for example, the first third of the country, north, we have 1.2 million people of 20 million inhabitants. In the last third of the country, we have 200,000 people in 1/3 of the country. So our entire population is concentrated in the middle of the country, and we have Santiago, the capital, that has 8 million people living in it. So why don't we use this relocation process to promote the socioeconomic integration of people? We can push economy in those regions and promote further investment and so on, with this huge labor force that could have rights and be regularized inside the country. I don't know if I answered your question.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to collect two questions at once, one from the audience and one from online. I see a hand already up here.
Yeah.
I think just behind you, sorry. It was really high up, but you can.
It resonated. Hello. Oh, yes. Thank you so much for your presentations. All three of them really resonated, and it resonated as a Rotary Peace Fellow. It resonated as a son of political refugees. And it also resonated because the way in which you told a personal experience, a complex issue, You showed that peace building was very nuanced and difficult, but you all had calls for action. So my question is, in that call for action, what is the role of the international community? You talked about political will. You talked about sentiment changing. What is the role of the international community? Sometimes the personal is connected to the political. What can international humanitarian organizations do? Which ones can help to move what's happening in your experiences in the homes and the communities to which you've had experience?
So we'll take one question from online, and then each of you can decide whether to answer this or the other question that's been asked.
Okay, this one also deals with the issue of political will, and it's more relevant to those that are from democratically elected governments. How do you make these proposals or changes that you indicate have impact on society's perceptions or support for making them? So if you could talk about how do you, what are the challenges of doing things that you know someone or a group of in society will complain, or there might be some unrest. So how do you mitigate that?
The question about international organizations and the question of political will. I saw you had your hand for international organizations. Would you like to
Yeah,
kick us
sure.
off?
So like I addressed in my presentation, and using Brazil's case, currently they are working at the border, for example, with UNHCR, with IOM. We also have in Chile agencies, the same agencies. Why don't we integrate them into this holistic response to migration? They have the expertise, the technical advisory. Currently, what is happening is that we have this decree that has a general appointed for security enforcement. And all the things that fall under this umbrella of security response are under his responsibility, but everything else is in parallel coordinated, even the international organizations. So there's no connection between all the agencies, state agencies, and international agencies on the ground. Why don't we build a structure that supports all, and each one of them can address and put their input in addressing this situation better? So I will respond to that. Yeah, there's technical expertise that we could use, and we're currently not doing anything. What is happening on the ground is actually, for example, soldiers or units, big units, are asking UNHCR or IOM to provide more in-depth instructions about migration management. What is happening now is the soldiers are getting deployed, and I would say they say they are trained. No, they're not trained. They're prepared in a week or two for security, for migration management, and then they're deployed for 15, 30 days, and they're doing rotations. So every person in 1 year at least spends 3 months at the border. So we're increasing the risk so far of something happening. Thank God, so far we haven't reached that that level of tension where someone dies because of this interaction between the military force and the migrants. But let's use the capacities, like I said before, this technical expertise, this expertise of years of migration management is supporting this in a more holistic operation.
Thank you. And for those who don't know the acronyms, the UNHCR is the UN Refugee Agency, and the IOM is the UN Migration Agency. So these are actually two different agencies, but in many places they're having to work together to address migration and displacement, which can be hard to disentangle. Christian, do you have any thoughts on either of the two questions?
Hello. I guess just addressing the second question then about political democratically elected, how to increase this how this governments are perceived and the public's opinion about these governments, and how to increase that, addressing the problems that we brought here today, if I understood correctly the question. I believe that it's an easy answer and way out for these governments when facing problems like the one in Colombia, to go for military answers, right? So let's put the army on the ground, let's fight it. And that, for the short period, kind of increases the public's perceptiveness. about how the government is dealing with it, but it doesn't bring long-term and effective dividends to address the root cause of the problem. So for example, when you start to focus on local policies to develop locally led or engaging that local population, offering services and economic opportunities and being present on the long term, you will have results. So not the short term, and unfortunately, governments they only focus on the end of their mandates, right? So it's only 4 or 5 years, unfortunately. So that's why they don't consider long-term solutions. So for example, for instance, if it's an easy way to think. When you create jobs for the youth population, they have an opportunity to decide to work for something instead of going to fight for the guerrillas or to go to illicit activities, right? So at least you're giving them a choice and bringing job opportunities, capacity training, capacity building, vocational training to those local populations so they can engage, they can be an entrepreneur, they can have opportunities instead of waiting on the government assistance or just deciding between joining guerrilla or not. So that will pay dividends for the long term, and numbers matter. So creating more jobs, creating local development, probably in the long term, conflict, deaths of coming out of conflicts would also decrease, and the public's opinion about the government would also increase. So that's my opinion, my take.
Regarding call for action, so I have mentioned in my presentations, and as considering the situation in Afghanistan, so you all might aware of the the basic right of girls and women for both educations and work. It's a big challenges. It is a country in the world who the women and girls are denied of educations. So basically our call is like to raise this awareness and to talk everywhere that human rights is matter. No matter it's Afghanistan or it's another countries. So please care about human rights, and human rights is important, and we should matter and consider each human being equal. And regarding my experience and expertise to address the challenges is, in my case, in my country, Afghanistan, based on my experience, based on understanding that I have worked with the communities, is first to identify and find out the needs of the people. If you find out the needs and the problems, then according to that, we can address those problems. What happened in the past 20 years that most of the aid, of course, Afghanistan is aid dependent. It's important source to solve the problem and bring peace in the communities because they are aid dependent. It's to consider and to find out the needs and accordingly address that problems. It happened that the donors approach from the top without considering the basic and priority needs. So it's important to find out the needs and accordingly solve it. Yeah,
Thank you. We have a few more minutes, so time for one more question. Okay, how about the one we skipped over right at the beginning? Here's your chance. Yeah.
Pressure's on, and it has to be a good one. All right. Thank you, Christian, for your service in Colombia. I agree. Colombia is a beautiful country with a beautiful people and beautiful literature, sublime poetry, magical realism. It goes on and on. My question, though, deals with the peace treaty, which we remember was voted down originally by the electorate in Colombia. So we're looking at the second treaty here. And this is a 6-decade civil war that went on. A lot of atrocities, neighbors killing neighbors, all of those things. Several of us had the opportunity yesterday to attend a really excellent program on forgiveness. Forgiveness is becoming more and more a part of Rotary programming. So my question to you is, after 6 decades of the Civil War, and you mentioned a lot of the reasons why the peace treaty was voted down, and that they're being addressed with economic and political changes. But one thing I didn't hear you address was forgiveness. So my question is, does forgiveness play a role in this sustainability of peace in Colombia?
Great question. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. So there is a forgiveness, and congratulations for those who participated in the workshop. I only hear good things about it. Forgiveness definitely plays a role, I won't say in the development, but in the conflict itself, right? And how it keeps rolling over the time. So we have, for example, Colombia embedded in the peace agreement is trying to, it's still in the process, right? It's a long-term process, installing the restorative justice. So, for example, we talk about the former combatants and the guerrillas and the paramilitary and all that, but what about the victims, right? So all the communities that were affected, that were displaced, that lost their family members, all these grievances and right, that they don't go away. So there is, instead of just a transitional justice, bringing everybody to justice and all that, there is another process going on, which is the restorative justice and the truth commission, the truth telling. So the truth telling brings the truth of what happened. Why did those people got kidnapped and they vanished? Where are they? Right? And what happened? Who were the real perpetrators of the atrocities that we saw over 60 years? So there is a place for forgiveness through the restorative justice in Colombia. It's not easy, right? Imagine you are from a small village, you have your family, you lost family members, the guerrilla displaced you, many atrocities and massacres and all that. And suddenly, okay, there's a peace agreement, and you get, as a victim, you get to face the perpetrators, and there's a forgiveness process that has to go on. So how to implement that? How does that go? It's different from country to country, from context to context. But in Colombia, they're trying to do that, but it's not easy. There's a lot of stigmatization toward the former combatants from the population as a whole, and especially from the victims, and stigmatization toward the victims too. And as victims, I can say victims, there are indigenous communities, and not only regular rural peasants, but the whole Colombian people. So there is a process of forgiveness. And if the peace process takes long, forgiveness takes even longer. So it's really hard, but they are trying as a role model to the world through this peace process. That was a great question, yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful questions, and thank you to our wonderful fellows for your insights and expertise.